She's literally doing anything to stay relevant.
Does anyone actually give a f*** about her?
Why are we keeping this girl relevant?
Your 15 minutes are up.
Your joke was funny for 2 days. Stop.
Y'all really thought I was done? I'm just getting started, baby.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's actually happening. Everybody's worst nightmare is coming true. The Hawk Tuah Girl has started her very own podcast. If you haven't heard of the Hawk Tuah Girl, then honestly, you're not missing out on much. In June of this year, this video blew up.
What's one move in bed that makes a man go crazy every time?
Oh, you gotta give him that Hawk Tuah and spit on that thing, you get me?
Since then, she has been all over the internet, making her way to the mainstream with that Hawk Tuah power. She's also been trying her hardest to make headlines by any means necessary. In fact, not too long ago, she actually made temporary headlines for saying that Young Gravy was trying to slide into her DMs. And all of that started with this clip right here.
Any celeb crushes, any celebs in the DMs that you want to throw out there and let us know?
Young Gravy.
No way.
I was like, you know.
Do you think he's trying to like get with you, or?
He wants to take me on a date. I was like,
No way.
As you can see here, while faced with a hard-hitting question, she really has to think about her answer. And she's kind of new to this whole fame thing, so Mrs. Tuah isn't accustomed to paparazzi. She doesn't really know how to evade and dodge questions quite yet. So right here, she's searching her brain for any celebrity DMs from the past 24 to 72 hours that she can use to make headlines. And Young Gravy's name came to mind. Apparently it was the first name to pop up because it was a thinker. And she probably thought that Mr. Gravy would sit back and let her make him look like a hungry stray dog. But no, this man posted on Instagram the following day to set the record straight. And as it turns out, he did have a conversation with her, you know, congratulating her on all of the success, and even inviting her to an upcoming show. He actually says in the same message that he's not trying to finesse her, in his own words. And that's basically him saying that he's not trying to hit on her, which is gentleman behavior, truly. I think Mr. Gravy did a fine job here of handling himself. However, Haliey did not do the same thing. She tried to twist this narrative. That's pretty sad, honestly. So, with these desperate theatrics, on top of the basic nature of Haliey's entire image, whose media company is this podcast under? Why, none other than Mr. Jake Paul, the boxing legend, the geezer fighter, the Disney Channel. This doesn't shock me one bit. Jake Paul is the type of man to have something like this tied to his name. It matches his entire image perfectly. It's trashy, distasteful, and nobody cares. Jake signed Haliey to a contract and will host her podcast. This means that we will be getting weekly episodes of the Hawk Tuah Girl interviewing different celebrities on her new podcast. The first episode featured Whitney Cummings and Jake Paul himself. And I've got to be honest with you, I can't see any longevity from this entire thing. The name of this podcast is Talk Tuah, which I know is as original as it gets, and it really does stick close to the source material, but the entire idea of this show revolves around such a boring concept that hardly anybody will care about. Anybody with a good attention span, that is. Like, aside from the meme ability of this entire thing, I feel like there aren't a lot of deep conversations that can grow from the concept of the words Hawk Tuah, especially given the entire context to how this clip even happened. And so far, based off of the first episode, I'm already thinking that this podcast will make like Humpty Dumpty and have a great fall. I'm unfortunately watching the first episode while I'm writing the script for this video in order to have a good understanding of what this entire podcast is about. And so far, I think it's just a podcast that revolves around random general stories that you'd have with your buddies when you're drinking or sparking some jazz cabbage, which might be a fun idea in theory, but the execution here is incredibly boring, especially what Haliey is delivering in terms of being this podcast's so-called host. From what I'm hearing, Whitney is doing most of the carrying so far in terms of being alive and having a conversation. It feels more like this is Whitney's podcast, which isn't a bad thing on its own. Whitney seems to have a very good talk show host kind of energy, which is great, but this isn't Whitney's show. It's Haliey's, and that's not a knock on Whitney. It's not her fault that she had to carry this conversation. She's just trying to keep the show alive, which is kind of how I expected this entire thing to play out. And I was watching an interview with Haliey on a podcast from a few months ago, and apparently there was a huge part of her that did not want to be known as the Hawk Tuah Girl in the first place.
Like, what did you want to do when there was a search? Was there a part of you that was like, I don't want to be known as the Hawk Tuah Girl?
Yeah. there was a big part of it. And then they started spelling my name wrong and making, like, accounts of me.
If that is something that you don't want to be known for, don't you think that putting the podcast title as Talk Tuah will further cement you as the Hawk Tuah Girl? Like, if somehow this podcast gains legitimate steam and becomes a regular show, I feel like it will be harder and harder for Haliey to get away from the Hawk Tuah image, especially if she continues to beat the dead horse that is this catchphrase. Haliey seems like a nice person altogether, and maybe she actually can hold a long, in-depth, and meaningful conversation, and maybe she just needs more practice speaking into a microphone. Like, I'm not gonna rule that out, but based off of this podcast with Bill Maher, I think she might have a ways to go.
What matters now is move past, let's call it your origin story. And it's very much like the Kardashians.
Mm-hmm.
You know origin story from comic books, right?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. So what's the Kardashians' origin story?
They started out before all the plastic surgery and everything else, didn't they?
No, what's their origin story? What put them on the map?
I'm not up to trends. I had to figure out who you were today.
Honestly, this is the most awkward podcast interview I have ever witnessed. One of the comments said something along the lines of this sounding like a conversation with Leonardo DiCaprio and one of his 20-year-old girlfriends. And I can't unsee it now. And I know that Haliey might be a bit intoxicated in these clips, but still, seeing this does not give me any confidence for an engaging interview from her. She can barely hold a conversation here, and apparently in the first episode of her podcast as well. Like, I'm gonna be honest with you guys, I was surfing through this podcast to find some interesting clips that I could play for you, maybe some dialogue, maybe a crazy story, or anything that just makes this podcast sound remotely interesting, but there's nothing. It's an hour-long podcast, and I had zero takeaways from it. I feel like I wasted an hour of my life, and I probably did. There was no meat to those potatoes. I don't even think there were any potatoes. There was no food. And I understand that she's relatively new to the whole interview thing, but if you're going to have an entire podcast under a fairly well-known media outlet, you should be able to hold a decent conversation for a long period of time in order to hold some viewer retention. And I have a feeling that a 5-second clip of a drunk, energetic burst talking about spitting on that thang is not going to reflect the same image after hours of conversation. And based off of the first episode of this podcast, that might actually be the case. This entire episode had no standout points. There was nothing that made me chuckle in the slightest. And I'm not trying to hate, honestly. I love to see people win, but I am a simple man. It doesn't take a lot to make me laugh. So if nothing from this hour-long podcast can make my small brain even muster up a tiny chuckle, then I don't know how anybody else is going to find any value in it. Now, I'm not saying Haliey Hawk Tuah is a bad person. She seems like a nice girl, but that initial charm quickly fades after even 5 minutes of listening to her. And that's nothing against her as a person. That's just my opinion. And I know a lot of people cannot stand to listen to the sound of my voice, so I hope they're sitting down when they're watching this video. I think this whole Hawk Tuah meme is some of the saddest content to come out of the internet in recent years. Like, the video itself is kind of chuckle-worthy, but that's it. It reminds me of a simple Vine video from back in the day that you'd see in a compilation on YouTube. But for some reason, it's turned into a phenomenon that has spawned an entire podcast and a line of merch longer than my toenails after a depressive episode. I can't imagine anybody actually listening to this in their free time, but I probably will be proven wrong. I'm sure the ratings might be decent for the first couple episodes at least, because of the hype building up around it, but I can't imagine this podcast going the long haul, guys. I've tried to sit down and watch some Hawk Tuah interviews for the sake of trying to give her the benefit of the doubt, and I've never been so bored in my life. I really wish the best for Haliey Hawk Tuah going forward. I hope she finds her niche and gets her bread, but with this podcast, I don't know that that's going to be where the bread is, honestly. What are my summarized thoughts on the first episode of this podcast? Boring banter that will make you tune out after the first 15 to 20 minutes. I can't imagine anybody actually listening to this for an entire hour. When I tell you that I barely made it through it, I'm not kidding. The host herself barely seems like she wants to be there. If the host is not interested, why should the viewer be? I think to summarize this whole scenario, it's a good thing to note that if the host of a show is not engaging, then the audience members will not be engaged either. Boy, oh boy, what a stinker. I want to know what you guys think about this entire situation in the comments. Do you think this podcast will take off and dethrone Joe Rogan himself? Or do you think it'll flop like a fish out of water and be canceled like a Netflix original after the first season or maybe even the first 5 episodes? I don't know. Let me know what you think. And be sure to drop a like if you enjoyed the video. Also, if you're watching this and you've made it this far, then be sure to click that subscribe button to stay updated when I upload a new video. Stay frosty, be good people, and I'll see you next time.